In business today, 3 things to know. First, it's tax day in the U.S. Why are so many corporations fleeing the nation? It's because we have one of the highest rates in the world. Is that keeping billions of dollars offshore? Then, it's not a monster yet, but is the risk of inflation stomping on Americans becoming real? And in the corner office, real estate mogul Don Peebles is here to talk about the seesaw housing market. Arise Xchagne starts now. Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Schmertz. It's tax day, the deadline for individuals to file their taxes. While you may either owe taxes or hopefully get a refund, you may like to hear that the U.S. is less in debt than it was last year. Get this, the nation's deficit comes in at $492 billion. That's down a full quarter from last year. But how much revenue is the country missing out on because its high corporate tax rate? At 39%, we have one of the highest corporate rates in the world. However, a study by the Government Accounting Office says corporations actually only pay around 12% after taking advantage of various loopholes. So which number is accurate, and why are more and more companies moving their headquarters elsewhere and parking cash overseas? Michael Null is a University of Pennsylvania law professor and co-director of the Center for Tax Law and Policy, and he joins us on the phone. Michael, thank you so much for joining us here on Arise Xchagne.
Thank you very much for having me.
So what number are we supposed to believe? We hear the 39% tax rate, and then there's a story by Andrew Ross Sorkin in the New York Times yesterday that says in reality, corporations are only paying 12%.
Well, both numbers. Marginal tax rates, especially for domestic income, can be quite high. On the other hand, the marginal tax rate on overseas income, the effective rate can be quite low, especially if you can keep that money abroad for a long time.
And what kind of drag, then, is this having on our ability to collect taxes? We hear the argument that we have these high taxes. If we lower the tax rate, if we had some sort of amnesty, we would end up repatriatizing billions of dollars. Apple having more than $100 billion overseas, for example.
There's tons of money overseas, a combination of the worldwide tax system that the U.S. has, whereas U.S. companies are taxed on their worldwide income, and the high tax rate encourages those companies to keep that money overseas, where it generally is taxed at a very low rate, and not bring it back where it would be subject to taxation at the full rate.
And the second issue is that companies are actually now picking up and moving their domicile. Walgreens is talking about doing that, for example. Have we seen that trend increasing?
We have seen it increasing. In recent years, it became popular once again. It's trended up and down. And, of course, the government responds. The government responds by making it harder and harder for corporations to leave. Just by changing the law and by increasing the requirements that are necessary. It's not simply a business decision. As you pointed out, it's domicile, and that means where the corporation basically files its papers. And it used to be very easy. All you had to do was really file your papers abroad and you can move overseas. Now you have to merge with a substantial corporation abroad to do so.
Well, let me ask you also what you think about the political environment, because both parties say that they want to reform the corporate tax structure. What do you believe they should head to? What is sort of a reasonable goal we can get to on this?
Well, that's a good question. Let me start, if I can, by explaining perhaps the two poles. And if I can just take a minute by way of introduction with that. The U.S. tax system differs from most other developed countries' tax system in that we have a worldwide tax system. Our companies are taxed on their worldwide income. Most companies around the world are taxed only on their income that's earned locally, not on their income that's earned in other countries.
So if Apple sells iPhones in China, they're getting taxed on that here in the United States?
Ultimately, they're obligated to pay tax on that in the United States, whereas if Samsung does it, they're not obligated to pay tax in their home country.
And
that's an important difference. But if I can then sort of then follow up, the U.S. also, even though we have a worldwide tax system, we have what's called deferral. Deferral means Apple doesn't get taxed until that brings that income back to the United States. So Apple's incentive is to keep that income abroad, overseas, and not bring it back to the U.S.
Yeah, it seems that we have a policy of encouraging and disincentivizing companies to bring the money back here.
Well, absolutely. And people make two arguments reflecting both of the points that you've been raising. One argument they make is we need the tax revenue for the reasons you described. We have a big deficit. The debt is increasing. Even though the deficit's going down, the total amount of debt's obviously increasing. And one way to increase that is to eliminate deferral. Mm-hmm. Tax U.S. corporations abroad immediately on their income earned abroad, whether they bring that money back or not.
But then we may see more corporations leaving the United States as a domicile. Michael, no, we have to wrap this up. There's so much.
That's the other argument.
Right.
The other view is let's move towards territoriality. Let's stop taxing companies on their overseas income. And the counter argument there is, well, many companies seem to be stripping income, or allegedly are stripping income out of the United States. They're even taking U.S. income, or what should be U.S. income, and are able to effectively move that outside.
Okay, Michael, we're out of time. There's a lot here to talk about, including double taxation with dividends, et cetera. So we'll have you back on shortly to talk more about this.
Thank you very much. It's a complicated and important subject.
It is indeed. Thank you, Michael Knoll, for helping us make sense of it all. After a volatile day of trading, U.S. markets posted positive gains on strong earnings news. Taking a look at how the markets finished, the Dow up 88.88 to 16,262.12. The NASDAQ up 11.47, and the S&P 500 closing at 18.42.98. Taking a look at some of the stocks we're watching today, online retailer Amazon reportedly close to releasing a smartphone, according to industry experts who say Amazon's smartphone will be introduced in June and will have a screen capable of displaying 3D images without having to wear any glasses. That will be good when you're walking down the street now looking at 3D images. Amazon closing up 17 cents to 316 and change. Struggling smartphone maker BlackBerry says it's bought a minority stake in privately held healthcare IT firm Nant Health. BlackBerry up 7 cents. And General Electric's top executive Jeff Immelt has reportedly considering exiting the company before his 20-year tenure expires. According to a report in the Wall Street Journal, GE is closing at 25.82, up 11 cents. Taking a look at commodities, gold down 23.40, oil pulling back to 103.55. You might be feeling it every time you shop for food or pay the rent. Prices are going up, and that's now reflected in basic inflation numbers, both the Consumer Price Index and the core inflation rate. The CPI rose by 0.2% in March, with food accounting for most of the increase, and the core rate also rose 0.2%. Is it time to worry about inflation? And does that mean we're in for rising interest rates and a slowing stock market? Kathy Boyle is president of Chapin Hill Advisors. Kathy, welcome back to Arise Exchange.
Nice to be here.
Let us start with inflation. I don't know why it took the government so long to get around to telling us there's inflation. Everybody knows they're paying more for some things.
Everybody does, but when you look at the reports, they're all worried about disinflation. As disinflation is a real concern, because if real nominal prices go down, can't pay your debt service, you're actually losing money, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what they're really afraid of. So they've been pushing this ball towards inflation, but the negative on that is for the average Joe, the average consumer, more to fuel up your car, your propane bills, your fuel bills for the wicked winter we had, very tough, and also food prices, your groceries are going up. You know, some places 20%.
When I was in Washington at the IMF hearing, at the IMF conference, they talked about a real risk of deflation in Europe. And you think, and they're worried about deflation here in the U.S. as well.
Well, they have been.
Right.
But yes, it's pretty clear that Europe looks like it's heading in a deflationary environment, and that's their problem. It will affect us, but that's a concern. But that's part of why the Fed has continued to ease this money, is try to stimulate things, to get the wealth effect going, get things going. But we have factors we can't control. You know, we have the drought in California. We've had this wicked wicked winter. We have these floods. We have, you know, the...
And a 0.2% number, and again, that's not the real number because they take out all these things that we actually pay for things. Right. What is the real inflation number in your opinion? Where are we?
I think it's closer to 4%.
And is that a good number?
It's not a scary number, but it does compound. I mean, you have the rule of 72. So you take 72 and divide the number in, and they'll tell you how long things double. So if you take that in, you know, and if not that long, you're doubling your coffee, your apples, your grain, your beef, whatever it is that you buy. And
wages don't keep pace.
Exactly. And also remember, the farmers are also an aging demographic. You got baby boomer farmers, you got Farmer Joe dying. Wife, you know, Martha doesn't quite know what to do. It's being bought up by consortiums. They're running it more effectively, but they are using GMO and lots of other additives, which there's a big pushback against that. But that's going into all the beef and the cows, the sheep, et cetera, for those who eat meat.
If you look at the stock market, we're starting to get this pullback, and you have an interesting note that's saying momentum is great, and momentum works until it stops working. Are we at sort of the pendulum where the momentum is now getting pulled back by gravity?
We'll have to see. But it's, you know, momentum is like a game of musical chairs. You know, you're going around, and it's great while the music is going. But when it stops, it's dead stops. And if you're the one without the chair, trouble.
And momentum goes both ways.
It does. It does. I mean, look at the losses we've had. NASDAQ down about 10%, but 29 of the NASDAQ 100 stocks have fallen 20%.
Wow, so that would be beyond bear market territory.
They have their own little
stocks.
bear market going on, and those are the high flyers. And remember, the rule of money, it hurts more on the way down. So if you have $100 and it goes up to $300, if that $300 falls 20%, it falls $60.
That's right.
So that's a big difference, you know. So on the way down, these losses hurt. And if you were a late Sally and you didn't get in until everybody else, that's part of the problem.
The question everyone's asking, though, is this a cyclical pullback that we're due for, or are there fundamental problems here?
Well, I personally look on the technical side. We think that we're due for correction. It's been quite a few months, a number of months. And now you've got people like Sam Stovall at S&P who have always been really bullish. He's calling for 20% plus. We're coming into the May period, May to go away in May.
And by the way, in fairness, that fuels momentum on the downside. When everybody starts coming on and saying we're headed, you know, I saw a note on Business Insider from Jim Cramer saying that the Passover theme, the market's headed for 10 plagues.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And people love it, you know, and they need PR, you know, and they need to get in the news. So once the momentum starts going bearish, all the former bulls from last week, because we have no documentation. You know, you could be bullish last week, bearish this week, and everybody just hears your latest call.
Yep.
So, but I do think underlying, we've got a high valuation on the market. We've got.
You do think valuations are high?
I do. The Russell is trading at 102 times trailing. It's gone up 5 times in the last few years, and it's 3 times more expensive than NASDAQ overall. So the small cap stocks have been the winners, but that's where valuation is pricey.
And of course, finally, you do have this overhang of what the Fed may do with interest rates, and they have not made their message particularly clear.
Right, and interest rates may not skyrocket. They may just, you know, trundle along in here, and they may gradually go up. But if we don't have good earnings and we don't have fundamental, look at the beats that have been coming in. In some cases, they're only beating reduced estimates, and they're under last year's estimates, or last year's numbers.
It's easy to beat lowered expectations.
It is, and that's really the
people
game
have to
that's
really
been going
look at
on.
that.
Exactly.
And you also have to look at, is this top line growth, or are they starting to see some bottom line growth?
So
and that's
far,
still pretty weak.
We're not really seeing the bottom line. We're not really seeing the numbers go.
All right, as we get the earnings news, we'll have you back on, Kathy, to talk about it. Kathy,
Thanks.
boy, I appreciate it. Coming up, it's never been polite to talk about your salary, but why the government may compel you to do so soon. You're watching Arise Exchange.
News can definitely be improved when reflecting diversity.
A lot of mainstream news, they don't dive into it.
Who wants to hear about negativity all the time?
They only show what they think people want to know and not what people really should know.
World-based stories, that's what I enjoy the most.
I think diversity of news is important to the world so that everybody will be aware of their surroundings and what is happening today.
Arise News, every culture, every angle.
Welcome back to Arise Exchange. We just started talking about earnings news with Kathy, and we do have some numbers out. Let's start with Coca-Cola. The beverage giant shares fizzled in early trading today after reporting lower than expected first quarter earnings and an increase in revenue. Coke reported a $1.62 billion profit. That's 36 cents a share for the January-March period, but it is down from $1.75 billion or 39 cents a share for the same period last year. Coca-Cola closing up at the end of the day by $1 to 45 cents, $40.18, excuse me. Drug maker Johnson & Johnson, the makers of Tylenol and Listerine, reporting just over $18 billion in first quarter revenue, beating estimates. The company's net income came in at $4.4 billion. That's a 7.8% increase over the same time last year, resulted in earnings per share of $1.54. Johnson & Johnson closing up $2 to $99.20. And Yahoo topping analyst expectations, reporting just over $1 billion in first quarter compared to $1.074 billion a year ago. The company said it earned $311.6 million in the first quarter net income. That's 29 cents a share. Yahoo closing up 76 cents to 34.21. Time now taking a look at our business ticker. Stories making news around the world. If you have $1,000, you could become a homeowner. Officials in Detroit have launched a new website to help sell abandoned and foreclosed homes in the Motor City. The site is designed to auction city-owned houses to bidders who want to fix them up and reoccupy them under the city's new neighborhood rebuilding initiative. Starting May 5th, one home per day will be auctioned off. Google is moving beyond searching the internet to searching the sky. The internet giant has purchased Titan Aerospace, a 2-year-old startup that manufactures high-altitude drones. It's part of the company's efforts to bring internet access to all corners of the world. No word on how much Google paid. And soon you may be able to print in 3 dimensions at your local Staples store. The office supply company partnering with 3D printer manufacturer MCore Technologies to provide printers for its new service called Staples Easy 3D. The service will allow customers to upload their designs on the Staples website, then pick up the printed objects or have them shipped to their home or office, not unlike the photo and document printing service that the company already offers. Do you like to answer the question, how much do you make? Or are you prohibited from doing so by your employer? It's called pay transparency, and it's part of the fight to combat equal pay. The equal pay debate has then taken center stage again. To talk more about pay secrecy, policies at the workplace is Catherine Kimple, managing partner at Sanford Heisler Law Firm in Washington, D.C. Catherine, thank you for joining us here on Arise Exchange. This is kind of an interesting take on pay equality. You don't think about it so much, but explain to us how some employees are simply barred from talking about their salaries and why that makes a difference.
Well, approximately 60% of Americans working in the private sector are pressured or explicitly prohibited by their employers from talking about compensation or even asking any questions about compensation. And how that's effectuated is a range of ways. It includes explicit policies, but also simply managers saying things like, your compensation is private or is confidential, and be sure you don't talk about this with other people.
But you can understand why. Beyond the discrimination issue, you could understand why companies would want to do that, because 2 people in the same position may get different pay. They may negotiate it differently. They may do different work.
Well, as an employer and also someone who represents employees, what I know is that when corporations are doing the right thing, they have nothing to fear from questions, and they have nothing to fear from transparency. Secrecy only protects those people who are doing things the wrong way. And I want to correct something I heard a bit earlier. Nothing that the president or that the Paycheck Fairness Act would do would force people to talk about their compensation. Well, instead, what it would do is protect people who wanted to talk about their compensation from being retaliated against. And the reason that's important is when employees aren't able to talk about their compensation, they must, in essence, trust the goodwill of their employer. And what we know is that not everyone deserves that trust. There are lots of corporations that do it right, but there are also lots of corporations that don't, and that violate the nation's anti-discrimination and labor laws in order to pad their own profits at the expense of hardworking Americans.
You say, though, that some people are pressured into not talking about their wages. You don't see a scenario where if they remove this bar where you say, I'm just not allowed to talk about my wages, that the pressure will, in fact, be there to talk about their wages from other employees?
No, I don't think so, because I think that, as you noted earlier, there is, I think, an ingrained sense that these things aren't something that you have to talk about, and often are things that people don't talk about. But what I think that the president tried to accomplish in his executive order and what the Paycheck Fairness Act would do is provide protections for people who are essentially worried that they're being lied to or that they're being paid unfairly. And I think that that is an important protection to have in place. And I think that once that protection's in place, it's not going to change what happens around the water cooler in any sort of momentous way. What it's going to do is ensure that corporations can't punish people who ask questions that may or may not reveal problems. Maybe everything's being done the right way, and that's great. And what that'll mean for employers is it'll increase employee happiness. It will increase employee satisfaction and buy-in in a company. In fact, when there is transparency, what you see is people know that hard work is going to be rewarded. And if anything, it makes people work harder.
Well, but can't this be accomplished by companies having clear policies that hard work will be rewarded and you are paid in a non-discriminatory way, and accomplishing it in a way that people don't have to talk about their salaries? And I know you keep saying no one's going to be forced to talk about their salaries, but there's clearly a reason that we want to change and prohibit employers from barring this.
It can't be, because that assumes a sort of Pollyannish world where what a company says it does on paper, or what it even says it does to an employee, is what it actually does. I think a really great example of how changes like the ones being contemplated by the president and by the Paycheck Fairness Act are important is something that happened with a client of mine. She came in with a group of other women, and they had a range of gender discrimination concerns. But while others were quite confident that they weren't being paid fairly, she was adamant when we first talked that she was definitely being paid fairly. She told me that she'd done all the right things. She had negotiated her salary hard. She'd checked against the market, so she knew, she had a good sense, she thought, of what people should be paid in her industry, in her department. She'd done all the sort of lean-in things that people were supposed to do. And when we got the pay data from the company for everyone, what she was horrified to learn, and I was unfortunately
Catherine,
not surprised.
We're running out of the satellite window. I appreciate this. It's a very good point. It's a very complicated issue, and one that's certainly heating up, and we'll have you back on to talk more about it. Catherine Kipple, I do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ahead, a high-flying, wealthy fare dodger in London busted. Our favorite person of the day is next here on Arise Exchange.
The great thing about Arise Entertainment 360 is that we cover the 360 of entertainment, food, fashion, lifestyle, culture. We're able to cover it all. And the thing I love most about the show is we're able to do a stunning combination of high and low. So we can talk about Rihanna on the red carpet, but we can also speak about high art with people like Sanford Biggers and Hank Willis. We actually spend quality time with our guests, and we really get to know them. It's really intriguing because we get a 360 look at our guests.
Time now for our favorite person of the day, when we pick one person who grabbed our attention and not for the right reasons. Today, it is an unnamed top hedge fund executive who is also the UK's biggest subway fare dodger. The London man has been busted for dodging £43,000 in subway fares over the past 5 years. He did this through a rather ingenious way. The London tube system requires strap hangers to tap in their payment card when they enter the system and tap out when they leave. The fare is then calculated based on how far you go. It's called the Oyster system. But if you lose your card or only tap out and never tap in, it charges you a maximum £7.20. Had the man paid the full amount, it would have instead been double that, about £24 round trip a day. That's because he commutes from the affluent but distant town of Stonegate. When he got caught, he agreed to pay all £43,000 at once if he remained anonymous. Today, Londoners are calling for his outing and for him to be prosecuted, but some are giving grudging respect, saying he is a modern-day Robin Hood and the system isn't very good anyway for anybody to pay full fare. Either way, so far, the unnamed millionaire hedge fund fare dodger is our favorite person of the day. Next, we meet a man who left Wall Street. We actually aren't going to do that story. We are going to talk more, in fact, about Don Peebles, the real estate mogul, and the housing market here on Arise Exchange.
I
I think media and reporters have a lot to answer for.
AIDS, hunger, people not having running water, the things that we just take for granted.
I think the most important issues in the world today are education and poverty.
Terrorism and war, I guess, is always. It's always an issue, and the quality of life of certain groups of people in certain areas.
I think inequality.
Arise News, every culture, every angle.
As promised, here's our interview with Don Peebles. We may be in a rising interest rate environment. There's some concern there's too much investment in sort of the home categories. Where do you think we stand right now?
Well, I think we're on a trajectory going upward right now. What's happening is we're going up so fast because we've been in this recession, coming out of this recession, sort of like taking a ball, an air-inflated ball, submerging it in a pool and sitting on it for a while. And we've been sitting on it in the real estate market for almost 5 years and then getting off. The ball regains its trajectory to the surface, then it goes up. Now, what we need is to control it. And I think increasing interest rates would actually control our growth. And I think we need to have some control on growth because pricing is escalating so rapidly in major markets like New York City and Miami, Florida. They're making it so that it's almost unaffordable for most people.
And I'll ask you about Miami. And that happens as we get to a price point that people can't afford it, and then the prices start coming down, and you get a sort of deflationary pressure, and we want to try to kind of avoid that a little bit. Let me ask you about your business, because you diversified, and that has had to help you get through the financial crisis and the housing market crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we diversify geographically and product type. So I started off as an office building developer in Washington, D.C., because that was a dominant development use in Washington. Then we went to Florida, and it was hospitality, and then condos and offices. Then California, offices, residential. Nevada, gaming and hospitality. And New York, real estate, housing, by and large, and now looking at some hospitality. So we've been able to build the right product for the right market.
And you saw the growth in Miami very early on, did you not?
Yes.
The growth of South Beach and South Miami that came from nowhere and exploded up. What kind of tipped you off to be there? Is it the usual buy where people aren't buying kind of attitude?
A little bit, but also fundamentals. I was on vacation there with my wife in early 1992. And we were walking along Ocean Drive, and we're seeing these buildings in South Beach that were essentially dilapidated. And I said, wait a minute, this is the Atlantic Ocean in Miami, Florida, in the United States. A few hours from New York City, a few hours from Washington, D.C., this doesn't make sense. And it was beginning to pick up then. And we just saw, when you look at the values of where Florida was versus Washington, D.C., Miami, California, and you look and you say, Miami's so undervalued. And that's what we saw there. And what a wonderful climate, and no state income taxes. So it had a lot of fundamentals going for it. Plus, it was becoming a global market, not just South American, but global.
You mentioned no state income taxes. So I'm going to ask you sort of the business question then. Where is the friendlier places to do business from a state perspective? And how can states be more inviting to real estate developers like yourself?
Okay. Well, one of the things that we have to be careful about is not looking at what the tax policy is as being the determining factor of where there's a business-friendly environment. New York City is the epicenter of entrepreneurship. New York State's a very business-friendly environment. Its tax structure is higher, say, than many places. Of course, Florida has no state income tax. South Florida and Miami and the rest of the state is pretty pro-business through a tax policy, but a regulatory environment, it's a bit more restrictive.
So you think the regulations are a little bit better in New York? And of course, New York has location, location, location. I mean, you could do whatever you want in New York City. It's going to attract business.
Yeah, and it's a global market. So your clientele, you have a broad base of clientele. You have broad industries in New York, and Miami is a growing environment for business. So it's more of an emerging business market as opposed to New York.
You've also done something very interesting with public-private partnership and developing on government-owned land. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, we like the idea of going into an environment where, when we acquire property, that the price is not the sole determining factor. And so that allows us to use other assets that we have as a company, being creative, being able to work with communities, creating jobs and economic opportunities for small and minority businesses. And that has value. In the private sector transactions, it has no value. It's a sole determination, it's price. So if I want to buy the GM building, it's a price point. Boston Properties will sell it to me if I gave them them a compelling price. If I do business with New York City or New York State or Miami-Dade County, they're looking for broader economic benefits to the city as a whole or to the marketplace as a whole. So that means jobs for residents, expanding the property tax base, other things like that. So that allows us to play to our strengths a bit.
You mentioned minority businesses. We have only about half a minute left. Can you explain a little bit about whether the real estate business is more inviting to minorities these days?
Well, it's not inviting. What's very unfortunate is that we don't see much diversity, especially in large-scale development anywhere in the country, and especially, say, New York City. New York City is majority minority, but if you were to look at the top real estate developers in the city, they would not be minorities. In fact, it'd probably be 1 to 2 minorities, me being one of them, and that's unacceptable. But I think things are changing now as politics changes, because politics is transformational, and now that we have a different administration and a different focus, I think you'll see more diversity in New York City and other urban areas. I think you'll see follow as well.
Don Peebles, thank you. Big honor to have you on here. That's Rise Xchagne. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.